Hello friends, this is a great pleasure for me to introduce you with Professor P.K. Chaube from Indian Institute of Public Administration, New Delhi. Professor P.K. Chaube is a renowned economist and a great thinker and an author of number of research papers and books. And today he will be delivering a lecture on modern economic growth, rate structure and spread, which is particularly useful for the students of who are doing the course EEC06 of the course BDP program, bachelor degree program. And he will analyze the theories given by Kuznets, which bases on the discussion on the pioneering work of Kuznets. And as Kuznets' findings suggests that the main reason of the economic growth is the application of modern science or the science-based technology. And he will also tell about the spread of modern economic growth, that how it came from the Britain to the other European countries. Professor P.K. Chaube, please.
Thank you, Professor Angela Gupta. Dear friends, as you have already noted, this is a lecture on modern economic growth, and we shall be talking about the rate, structure and spread. Modern economic growth actually relates to a particular period, and as the other speaker, Professor Angela Gupta, was suggesting, that this is a work by Simon Kuznets. So modern does not relate to any particular time period or modern period which we normally understand. It dates back to 1950s, and maybe it may be ending by 1950s or 1960s. And the recent economic growth is slightly different. So I think you will bear in mind that this is a particular epoch in the history of economies, and particularly of the Western countries, that we shall be talking in this lecture. Now first you need to understand the meaning of economic growth. There could be occasional variations, but we have to understand it in terms of long-term tendency. So there has to be sustained increase in the per capita income, and that cannot come without sustained increase in the per worker output. There could be occasional decline, as you can see the two graphs which I have already put in the slide. On the left hand side you find that there is no rise, there is only fluctuation. But on the right hand side you find a graph where though fluctuations are there, that means business cycle may occur, but there is sustained growth over time. So this is important bearing, and in this context we have to understand what modern economic growth is. That means what is the epoch that is characterized by high sustained increase in GDP, GNP, and then with high sustained increase in population as well, such that there is increase in the per capita income. So this is very important, that this is a phase where the population also grew tremendously. It is no more a type of characterization which Malthus had in mind. So you can easily try to relate, and with this you will find that there had been a sustained increase in the per worker output, and perhaps a very important factor which has not been highlighted is that reducing workload per worker, at least in the later period. And this period you can easily relate from 1750s to 1950, and this is of course compared to the preceding centuries. But for your ease you can relate it to the British time in India, that is from the Plassey to your independence. So this is important idea which we have to keep in mind. But growth rate does not come in particularly in this period without some accompanying factors. So most important part is that there has to be a diversification of economic activities, and in terms of output and in terms of employment both. You will find that in previous say phases there might have been predominantly extractive industries, particularly agriculture and say mining, and later on it changes to industrial sector or to services sector. Now this is very important, because while technology will promote it, there has to be demand for it, and as you know that there is something like Angel's law, whereby people as income increases, people demand more of industrial goods and more of services. So with this you find that industrial structure is changing, and it is not changing only in terms of output, but it is also in changing in terms of employment. So more people get employed in the industrial sector, later on into services sector, and very few people are actually working in the agriculture sector. One has to keep in mind that the production of agriculture is not reducing, rather the productivity is rising in terms even in the sector of agriculture compared to previous phases, but relative importance is decreasing. Simultaneously you will find that the population is also moving towards urban centers. Either new centers are emerging, or new cities are emerging, or the old cities are getting accretion of population, and this is basically through migration. Now normally this migration in the western developed world was from Europe to America, or to southeast portions of the globe, that is Australia and New Zealand. But you will find that there has been some migration in this phase even from Asia and Africa, and of course for slightly different purposes. But this urbanization is a distinct phenomenon of this modern economic growth phase, and you will find when you go through the textbooks or the books which have been supplied to you or otherwise, that the use of output is also changing. It is not only say for consumption purposes, maybe for capital formation, maybe for export purposes, or maybe for what you call this durable consumption. So this is important part which you should try to look at. And one more important feature would be that this origin of output may also be changing. It may not be simply one place where this was originating. Maybe it is not the domestic, it is also import. This is what I would like to emphasize at this stage. Now this as you have noted that this lecture revolves around rates, structure and spread. Now this is important to note that this is a phase where per capita income grew around 15 to 30% per decade in different countries about which we are talking, and we will note when we are discussing about the spread that it was limited spread. So we are talking about certain developed countries, but this rate per decade may not seem very impressive to you. The simple reason that today we are talking of 7-8% rate of growth per year, and therefore this may seem to be very low. But at the same time, compared to pre-modern phase, this was actually very high. And so is the case about population growth, which rose by 10% plus per decade in different countries, which we will note which countries in due course of time. And these two combined factors imply that the GDP was rising by 20 to 50% per decade. Today we shall be thinking of doubling the per capita income over a decade, but this was a different period, and we have to note that there is some difference between modern economic growth and the recent economic growth. So important part is what explains it. And people have often suggested that this is a too high rate of a growth which cannot be explained in terms of increase in inputs per head, which means either the workload per man, which means in terms of man hours, or capital employed per worker cannot explain it. Hardly 1/5 of the growth can be explained in that terms, or later on even not even 1/5 but 1/6 or 1/7. So it is actually the increase in the quality of the inputs, and that quality comes from the technological breakthrough, institutional arrangement, also change, and how the inputs are combined, the whole process changes. And this is important part which you have to keep in mind. Now I am showing some growth factors per century, and you will find today we are talking these rate of growth in terms of per year, not in terms of even decade. This is important to realize that in early say 18th 19th century, you find that per capita income was growing only by 3.5%, but later on also it is only 3.7%. But this rate of per century population, this is growth factors. So during the century you can note that the GNP rose 12 times and the population grew by 3.4 times. As a result, per capita income over the century became 3.5 times. The later period, when it rose still by a higher factor, 3.7, population rate had come down, so had come down the GNP, but as the economies mature, the rates of growth are likely to come down. So that means the modern economic phase was set in a very high trajectory. Now that you will notice that France, which is a latecomer, the per capita income grew by 5.2 times over the century, and so you find that Italy, USA and Australia. Italy is in the south of Europe, whereas US is a European settlement, and so is the Australia. And you can note from these figures, and they may not look very impressive to you today, but actually compared to pre-modern phase, they are very, very important. And this was the phase when the population was also rising. That you have to bear in mind. Now I am giving you some population statistics so that you can relate that before 1980 the world population was hardly rising by 1.3% per decade, but after 1950 you find that it was 7% per decade, whereas European settlement this rise was much larger, 9.5 times. That means migration was of course from the rest of the part was coming to European settlement, which means we are talking of the whole of Europe, and we are talking of USA, New Zealand, Australia, Canada and so on. So this is very important. You can even see that the birth rate and death rate, how they were in the 1750s and 1950s, and you will find that there is a drastic reduction in the death rate, and of course you will see that there is some reduction in the birth rate as well. But then it is important that in both the phases the growth rate was pretty high. Of course after 1950s most of this developed world will settle down to a very small increase in population. Now we can see that we have been talking about the rate, but the structure is equally important, and the growth, where the growth was taking place in relative terms, and you will find that these economic activities are shifting away from agriculture to non-agriculture, and non-agriculture means industry and services. Of course there could be some exceptions, no doubt, and the same is about the relative shift in the absorption of labor away from agriculture to non-agriculture. Now within manufacture or within industry, you will find that some of the industries have just vanished and the new industries have come up, and electrical industry, electronics and those things later on do come up, and the consumer durables become more important. So all these changes within a couple of hundred of years one can note when one goes through the literature and tries to gather evidence from the national income statistics. Now, what was the spread? This is more important. And we find that spread started from northwest Europe, which is basically UK, and you find that this was the locus in the mid 18th century. Now, it is very important to note that in the previous phase, which was of mercantile capitalism, and that is how you might have read about the mercantile school, and there they were depending on the maritime activities. The new land was discovered and a lot of colonies were found, and at that point of time the companies like East India Company, which were the monopolies granted by the state, came into being, and they exploited this potential. Compared to that, we find that now there is a movement from this east to west, rather west Europe to Eastern Europe, and West Europe to Southern Europe, and you find that this locus which I have noted before you, England and Wales, the population was hardly 7.5 million, and which is half of the size of present Delhi, and it was then accounting for only 1% of the world population. Actually, in 1798, when Malthus wrote his celebrated book on population, the world population was just 98 crore, and you find that India is more than 98 crore today. So over time, this had been the phase since 1750s, that the population and economic growth both grew side by side. They were not opposed to each other, or it was not the case that the population size gets determined by the economic activity, and when economic activity gets determined by population, of course productivity and technology and other things become more important. And from this locus you find that the growth moved towards the east and towards the south in Europe, and then this growth also migrated to Americas, first to the north, including present USA and Canada, and then to the south, which you know as Brazil, Argentina, and so on, and of course far southeast, which is comprises the territories of European settlement, Australia and New Zealand. And we find that it was actually very limited, accounting hardly for 1/4 to 1/3 of the humanity. This is important, though this is or rather this is the set of countries which have been studied in great detail, and they may offer some lessons, but at the same time we do find that this whole spread was actually very limited, and it had not engulfed the rest of the countries in the world. One notices of late that of course Japan on the one hand, and communist Russia on the other hand, had also developed some of these traits. Of course those histories we are not going to relate in this particular lecture, but one can or rather one should take notice of this particular spread. Now the important point is why the rate of growth was so high. What were the distinct features of this particular phase? What did create the potential for this kind of rate of growth? So one notices that, as Professor Angela was telling you, that it was the application of science-based technology. which means there could be a technology which is not science based and there could be a technology which is science based, meaning thereby with experiments humanities had been developing technology, have been making use of, did develop the productivity, and it was empirical science. But when, or empirical technology, but when we talk of science based technology, that means certain scientific principles were evolved. Even the great inventions like steam engine was created, and before that actually laboratory had developed that this is the kind of impact which is very likely with the kind of innovations that are taking place. So this is very important, that the application of science based technology has to be contrasted with the pre-science technology as has been designated by various authors including Indians like Professor Kothari. So this is important, and many breakthroughs started with the steam engine, and empirical intervention, as I have told you, that they were followed by the scientific innovations, and then some of them I can relate to you were electrical, internal combustion engine, electronic gadgets, nuclear devices, and the biological. Of course, the today is biotechnology rather than biological, but biological processes were also evolved in a great deal in during this phase. Now we know that cotton textile was perhaps the first in the Britain which propelled this new phase, and combined with iron steam engine. Of course, those were the days when they had canals rather than railways. But steam engine at later phase suggested that even canals have to be closed down and the railways have to be led on the street. And you find that these were used in the manufacturing and transportation both, and that helped a great deal spurt in say rate of growth. Now more importantly, you have to notice, and I have indicated that there was an interplay of technology and institutional factors. Technology, I have given details in so many words, but institutional factors I have not so far spoken. So joint stock company and banking and many others economic institutional setup had to be evolved, and they were evolved, and the technology could be harnessed. Now they were intermingled with values of secularism and egalitarianism, and this is, and sometimes people also add to it nationalism. Now secularism has a very particular meaning, and this you have to notice, that secularism is respect for human life on this earth, which is paramount. It is not the life after earth or life after death which one thinks of, that one has to be very pious and will have or will inherit the heaven and so on. It is the material life which we concentrate on, and once you get interested in this material life, that is the basic meaning of secularism. Of course, I mean, in different discourses you find different other meanings of secularism. Now the second important part is that there was something like we call egalitarianism. Now what is this egalitarianism? This egalitarianism is about the political equality, and political equality means now labor is free and you can vote for different parties. Your votes count equal, they are not inferior to anybody else's vote. But it does not mean that you have equal incomes. So one has to be very careful about the value of egalitarianism. Actually, when one talks of French Revolution and one talks of equality, fraternity, and liberty, then that equality is of political nature. It is not of economic nature. So one has to be very, very careful. Now some people feel, and Kuznets have also emphasized, that nationalism was also an important value during this phase, which means our ties with the family and with the tribe and other affiliations, they are getting loose, and whereas the affiliation to some national entity is getting strengthened. So, and that was actually the phase of mercantile capitalism, but that keeps continuing during this phase as well. So friends, this is very important to remember, that it is not only the technology, because technology can create a capacity, but it cannot, make it actualize. For actualization, there has to be sufficient demand, the institutional structure has to be changed, and the new values have to be ingrained. Now, are there some lessons for the underdeveloped countries of the day? This is important, and I will suggest that some of the values today we talk of again, that a different kind of bonding or different kind of values have to be evolved, and perhaps feudal mode has to be done away with. But these days actually technology is again rising so fast, and the complex is changing, that there is no denying the fact that a high rate of growth can be attained in underdeveloped countries. For long, underdeveloped countries have been suggested not to having these values. They were not talking of so much of technology. They said technology could be transferred. Of course, there were problems even with this transfer. Now, more importantly, we have ignored the factors of natural endowment which some of the countries could be having, and this is the essence of the modern economic growth, that it is not depending so much on say natural endowment. It is depending on the creativity, it is depending on technology, it is depending on institutional factors. Of course, there could be exceptions where the per capita income could rise, and because of natural endowment, and such countries were actually ignored by Simon Kuznets. He said that if the countries were very small, they are depending on so many outside factors that they need not to be taken into account while describing the modern economic phase, or rather phase of modern economic growth. And he also suggested that he will not be considering those countries which could be endowed with natural resources, such as one single natural resource like say oil, because that is not developing the capacity or the technological capacity of the system. And of course, he is talking of, he is in fact suggesting that it is not actually the capitalism which other frameworks do suggest, but it is say other values like secularism and egalitarianism. In his understanding, the Marxian analysis, for instance, was based on too small a sample and too small say time. I think people may differ on that, because he is also talking of say the kind of tension which could be there in technology and the mode of production, which is actually the institutional factors. And when the harmonization takes place in the view of say Simon Kuznets, then the possibility of high growth rate emerges, and simultaneously there have to be say changes, sectoral changes in what you call the industrial structure, as well as use of the industrial output in different say variety for example, capital formation or say government consumption, consumer durables and so on. Now the important point that we have to note that with high rate of growth, with sectoral shift and along with population growth, this you find that the productive resources or productive quality of inputs rose a great deal. Now I think towards the end, what we have to emphasize to recapitulate the whole issue, I may again try to impress upon you that there are certain values which have been emphasized by Simon Kuznets, like secularism, egalitarianism, and nationalism, and they were the basic foundations. And then you also find that urbanization is a distinct phase. This is a phase when the most of Europe turned from rural to urban, and it is partly because of migration, rural to urban migration, also migration, occupational migration, maybe over generations, within the generation as well as over the generation, that people shifted from not only from one locale to another locale, but also from one occupation to another occupation, from one industrial say group to another industrial group. There might have been literacy, even is an important issue, but which has not been raised by Simon Kuznets. So you find that this great urban phenomenon also took place during this phase. As far as this technology is concerned, it was of course science based compared to earlier phases when technology was there, but it was not based on science. That means the principles were not discovered, but with experiments people had developed a variety of technologies. There was a lot of science when in pre-modern phase, but that science was not related to technology as such. Technologists were artisans, carpenters and blacksmiths, and they were using the principles which they learned from their practices rather than learned from the results that were obtained in the laboratories, maybe in situ or ex situ. So this is important to remember that the technology which we are talking of was science based, and the institutional factors, they grow from phase to phase, and some people on that basis do talk of slavery, do talk of feudalism, do talk of capitalism, also of course socialism and so on. Now Simon Kuznets is not taking that larger view. He is talking within a larger framework that some institutional factors are changing, like banking is coming into being. The practices of what you call rather factory system is evolving during this phase. Earlier there might have been just use of implements by the workers, but now you find that there is this factory setup which is employing the workers. Workers are using the tools, but tools are owned by someone else. So labor is now free, and it is the wage labor which is spearheading this particular growth. And then we find that this labor over generation is changing occupations and is also changing say locale. So urbanization is getting great spurt. And finally, perhaps I think towards the end I should again emphasize the values of secularism and the egalitarianism and nationalism. I think you can try to recall what I said about secularism, that it is not something related with what you call equal respect for religion, but it was related with this life on earth, which is paramount. It is important issue that we try to value the life herein rather than hereafter. And once you have this phase, you get interested in material advancement, and with that material advancement, with that kind of ethos, you demand a variety of goods. And naturally, when you see one variety, you crave for another variety and put a demand if something new could also be say produced. And this is how the growth also gets propelled. Some of the activities die down, but many more new activities come into being. Now, I said about the egalitarianism, and naturally, if it is a feudal system where there is serfdom, where you do not have say assertive power, where you are not free, then egalitarianism will not take place. So this is a phase when there is political egalitarianism, and that also helps to realize the capacity generated by technology. And nationalism, as I suggested, in certain cases they have been some people have emphasized the factor of nationalism, others have not. But this is a distinct phase where the nationalism is gaining momentum, and actually from this value the countries which later on got independence also learnt about nationalism, and the cohesive forces were generated in the far distant places. I would like to emphasize that this growth might not have spread that well, but the political ideas and particularly this nationalism is spread perhaps throughout the globe in all civilized societies, if not on the primitive tribal cultures. So I suppose in this lecture you have learnt about the contribution of Simon Kuznets during the late 18th century to first half of the 20th century. Now this particular phase, because earlier for in the centuries together the growth rate might have been just 1%, and in the earlier phases the population might not have grown altogether. It does not mean that the population did not grow since the time of Adam and Eve. It was growing, but in say millions of years the growth rate could be counted to be very, very low. Even very low growth rate, 0.0001% per centuries could give you a respectable number by 1750. Of course, this is not a just break, because during each phase you will find the things were looking up in certain sense better, in particularly the growth rate is concerned, the economic activity is concerned. Otherwise, if you have to define, for example, a phase, you have to see that there is some kind of continuation through the period, and when this trend either abruptly goes up or goes down, or there is a kind of acceleration and deceleration on a long-term basis, we say a different epoch has started. So actually this is a particular kind of historical epoch which has been described by Simon Kuznets in terms of modern economic growth, and where the three factors which he analyzes is about the rate, which is very, very high. It is about the structure of economic activity, which has changed from extractive agriculture activities to industrial and to service activities, and then spread. And here we notice that the spread during 200 years was not spectacular. It remained confined to the countries where certain values were also say evolved, and the countries where those values were not evolved to that extent. Actually, it is organic evolution, so it cannot be transported with ease, and that is why you find that the growth remained limited to the countries of European settlement. Only Japan could be an exception, and Russia is of course very much a part of the European life. There could be a very small proportion where Asiatic life was having some importance. So finally, again let me say re-emphasize that this growth rate is one where per capita growth rate is very high, which means GDP or GNP are rising with respect to population is a very say comparatively at a very high rate, and otherwise it would not have been possible. This is a distinct phase when the population was also rising, and that could not be possible unless the per capita per worker output was increasing, and the increase in per worker output could not be possible unless there was a great deal change in the technology which raises the efficiency of the system. And even if the capacity was increased, unless there were institutional collateral factors intermingled with values of secularism and egalitarianism, it could not have been possible to actualize the potential. And finally, some of the values which I again reiterate, that secularism, egalitarianism were two very important values, and that you got interested in material life and you became assertive because of the political equality, that this was possible in some of the countries where these conditions obtained. I think now this is the time we can bind up, wishing you a very happy reading on this particular topic, and I think you will be having a lot more to read about different countries where you will be easily relating this lecture with, and you will find that in the countries of European settlement some of these conditions did obtain, and that is why it could lead to say a new phase of economic life in the European settlement. Of course, the recent days and recent years are different, and where you will find that some of these things are getting replicated in the rest of the world, and maybe this phase which was distinct phase of the European countries and the European settlement countries is now of course plateauing, and the new phase is looking up in other countries. Thank you.